turn that on. There we go. Well, I hope y'all have had a good day. I've had a good day. Everybody had a good day?
Great day.
Anybody? Good. Anybody get rained on?
No.
I thought it was going to rain really hard there for a little while, but then it died out. All right, so who knows what we're talking about tonight?
One of the feasts?
That's right. So we're starting now that last week we went through why. So today we're going to start on the feast. So what's the first feast of the year? Who knows what the first feast of the year is of the Israel feast?
When does the calendar year start?
The calendar year starts on Nisan 1, which is right around 14 days before, 19 days before Easter.
So Passover?
Passover is not the first one. I just thought I would trick y'all. There's actually one that comes before it. It's simply called the 10th of Nisan.
The what?
The 10th of Nisan. The 10th day of the month. We celebrate it every year. I bet you had a celebration, most churches did, on that Sunday. We call it Palm Sunday, right?
Oh.
So what do you know of Palm Sunday?
But how did you spell that last word?
Nisan with only one S. Nisan.
Not like the car.
Never heard of it.
Almost like the car. I have a feeling they came from the same word, but
But it's basically the same thing as Palm Sunday, right?
it's Palm Sunday. But Palm Sunday comes from, why do we call it Palm Sunday?
No. The triumphant entry into Jerusalem and laying down of the palms.
And they had the palm branches there, right? So we call it Palm Sunday. Well, before it was ever called Palm Sunday and before Jesus entered, it was still a holiday. It was a holiday all the way back. If we go back to Exodus 12, that's where God lays out what to do for Passover. And the first thing he tells them in Exodus 12 is to take a lamb into your house on the 10th day of Nisan. The day of, and this is really neat for those of y'all that know that story of the triumphal entry and what happened over the next 4 days. 4 days before Passover, which is the day Jesus was crucified, you were to take a lamb into your house. You were to take a lamb into your house. So what happened 4 days before Passover? God took the Lamb of God into Jerusalem, into His house. What was the purpose that they had to take? In Exodus 12, it tells you, and we'll be in Exodus 12 a little bit tonight, but it tells you that they took him in, took the lamb in to inspect it. You had to make sure it had no fault in it. It had to be thoroughly inspected. You had to have a perfect, spotless lamb to be sacrificed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What happened on those 4 days after Jesus came into the house of God? Did they not inspect him? Did they not question him? All the way up until, well, I love the way it says that after he answered one question for him, it says, nobody bothered to ask him any more questions after that. They had confirmed he was the spotless, perfect Lamb of God. It's amazing to me how all these feasts are fulfilled through Jesus. They are all pointing towards something that we talked about last week, because Jesus is our Passover lamb, right? So at Passover we have a lamb. God told them, that's where the whole lamb thing started. It didn't start with Jesus, it started with Passover. The symbolism of the lamb started with Jesus, right? And that's why when John said, behold, the Lamb of God, he was referring to the Passover lamb, right? So when God told him to take a lamb, why did he tell him to take a lamb? There's a lot of animals around, right?
Yeah.
Why didn't he tell him take a bull? Why didn't he tell him take something else?
Well, that lamb would go without a fight.
That's one thing.
That was the ultimate sacrifice. That was the one that God told them to use. Ultimate. I mean, they had other ones.
Mhm.
But if you had a lamb, if you weren't fortunate enough to be wealthy enough to have the lamb, you could use other things. But the lamb was like the primo thing.
So why? Because it was after that he starts showing us to use the lamb in a lot of different sacrifices, which was pointing towards Jesus. But this being that first mention of a lamb, the closest thing we have is there was a ram, which is relative of a lamb, caught in the bush, and that's what Abraham sacrificed. But why did he choose the lamb to be the sacrifice? This is something I love teaching this because I didn't know this till today. I got to studying this out, and I bought a couple books on it so I'd have enough information to answer y'all's question. I got to reading, and I found this today, and I got to Googling around, and sure enough, it's true. I don't ever trust one source. But
Because it was such a innocent, meek, mild, gentle.
I love analogies, and when I make an analogy, it only works if you look at it narrow-mindedly. I love the way God's analogies work no matter what direction you look at them from. The lamb is a perfect symbol of everything that's encompassed in Jesus and the Passover sacrifice. It's all those things. But I never realized, did you know the Egyptians, they were coming out of Egypt, right? Did you know the Egyptians worshipped lambs? They worshipped sheep. They worshipped a lot of animals, but that was one of their main ones. That's why you'll read, and you may recognize this from Scripture, that when Joseph came, they wouldn't eat with Joseph, right? When Joseph was in Pharaoh's house and his brothers came up to get the grain, and he said, make me a meal and we're all going to eat. You remember where it said the Egyptians wouldn't eat with the Hebrews because they were shepherds? See, they ate lamb too. They ate sheep too, but the shepherds, they didn't respect it as the deity that they believed it was. They still believed it was, they worshipped it, but not as though that particular lamb was God. They worshipped different animals because they felt like they were a culmination of all these perfect elements put together, and they represented a deity. So they didn't mind eating them. They were still okay with that. But they didn't like shepherds because they didn't represent they herded them for meat rather than to worship, rather than to be a sacrifice. They herded them just to eat. If you notice, King Tut if you've ever seen a picture of King Tut, his little golden thing has a shepherd's nook there.
Mm-hmm.
Has a little, comes up on that side, has a little shepherd's nook. Because they valued a shepherd. They understood the value of a shepherd because Joseph told the Pharaoh, he said, my family are shepherds. They're good shepherds. That was something he was pointing out, a good trait. They valued that. But he didn't want them anywhere near them because he knew that shepherds were of value, but they were dirty shepherds. They just raised it to eat. They were just hungry, greedy. So they put them out in Goshen. They didn't have a whole lot of shepherds in Egypt. It wasn't real good land. So I thought it was amazing that 4 days before they're to sacrifice this lamb, they had to take it into their house. This is a very public sign. This is so the Egyptians would not miss it. The Egyptians would see them bring the lamb into their house and know that it's there for 4 days. Just a question, do you know your neighbors? What would you think? Would you ask any questions? If you seen them walking a lamb in their house and you knew a couple days later that lamb's still in there. Anybody ever been around lambs? Goats?
No, sir.
How do they fare on the olfactory system?
Billy got pretty.
They are wonderful animals. They have a lot of great purposes, and being in the house is not one of them. They do not work as potpourri, do they?
No.
They're dirty. Being in the house is not a good thing. You would question that, wouldn't you? That's a very public sign coming into the house, coming in and right in front of them, something that they worshipped, and you're going to eat it. And you're bringing it in there 4 days ahead, so you got plenty of time to converse with them. Because what ultimately happened to those Egyptians? Their firstborn sons all died. Whether they were 8 or 80, right? Was that fair? Does that sound like something a just God would do?
Not really.
It's kind of hard to understand, isn't it? But they had warning, didn't they? In this, we see a little bit of the warning.
What about that 3-month-old baby that's the first child? I mean, he didn't have any warning. He was totally innocent.
But unfortunately, our kids pay for our mistakes, don't they? I know my kids have paid for some of my mistakes. And that's probably what has deterred me from making those mistakes more than anything else in this world, when I've seen them have to pay for a mistake that I made.
But
This was coming from a long time.
if we wanted to look at it from a point of justice, we'd probably all be gone. If we were,
Yeah.
thinking that.
It's hard to see that sometimes, though, isn't it? The 400 years of slavery, I mean, this didn't just happen overnight. This was a nation that was oppressing its people on purpose. So who left Egypt after the Passover? Who got to go into the trek to the wilderness and to the promised land? All the Israelites, right? They were all strictly a nation of Israelites, right? I throw out trick questions sometimes. But there were Egyptians there too, wasn't there? So what was the requirement for going? You had to put blood on the doorpost, right? So Egyptians could have been saved just as much as the Israelites. So in a sense, it was fair. All who want to be saved, put the blood on the doorpost. The same opportunity was available to everyone, and that's kind of how we judge fairness a lot of times. It doesn't seem real gentle, but luckily he's God and I'm not, and he's better at it. I heard someone say one time, well, couldn't he have found a better way to do it? Really? Could you find a better way to do it? To accomplish his plan? He's accomplished a whole lot, I think, and I think he's doing pretty good at it. And when I try to accomplish things, I don't do so good at it. So I'm going to let him stick to his plan. So as we look at them, we see so much symbolism going on already. We see the 10th day and the lamb coming into their house, being inspected. We already see some of what Jesus is doing. But when we actually get to the Passover, that's the 14th day of Nisan. That's the day where Jesus shared Passover with his disciples. And then right after that, he was sacrificed. Judas came and sacrificed him, right? He was the Passover lamb and was sacrificed on Passover. Then we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of First Fruits that all sort of go along with that. I want us to look at a scripture. I got my Bible. I know I brought it in. There it is. Luke 22. Let's read a little bit.
What was it again?
Luke 22. How about Luke 22? Somebody want to read for me verse 7 down through 13?
Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be healed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat. And they said unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare? And he said unto them, Behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you, bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he entereth in, and ye shall say unto the good man of the house, The master saith unto thee, Where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he shall shew you a large upper room furnished, there make ready. And they went and found as he said unto them, and they made ready for the Passover.
All right. Now, I just counted at that time. I didn't count it before. I just knew it was in there a bunch. Would you like to guess how many times he uses the word prepared or another similar word there? I counted 5. I counted 5 different times. Go and prepare. Where do we prepare?
Yeah.
Room that's already set up that you should prepare. Go, and then they prepared the meal there. I've counted 5 times. So preparation was a very important thing for Passover, wasn't it? I'll go dead here. I hope I didn't need this thing. Guess I'll do without it. I didn't bring a cord. There are a lot of preparation that goes into this. A lot of things that have to be made ready. We talked a little bit about the getting rid of the yeast, all the yeast that was in the house. The reason I wanted to pull this up is it has that makes it too big. has a diagram of the plate. Hopefully Jackie will bring you one next week. This is the plate that they used, if y'all can see it. Basically looks to me like a deviled egg plate. Doesn't it? That's what we'd use it for around here. There was, I'll show you that now because the thing may go dead in a minute. At least then you've seen the picture. There was a lot of preparation that went into it. All the yeast had to be removed from the house, every last speck of it. They even had little rituals and games for it, and they would burn the last little bit of yeast that they find. They would set it on fire. They would burn out the yeast, the sin. God uses the same analogy with us, that He is an all-consuming fire and that sin will burn up in His presence. It's amazing all the symbolism that goes into this. If you take part in a Passover, you start to see that every single thing is just dripping with symbolism, that there's so much meaning and God doesn't waste a single thing. So as we think about this, I don't plan on sharing with you the whole Passover night because that's Jackie's job. She's going to share with you a lot of the symbolism and what different things meant and why they did those things. I assume she'll share with you whatever. I don't really know for a fact. I'm just guessing. But I want us to talk about what that means for us. What was the point? What is the big takeaway from Passover? Why did they have Passover? What was the point?
To remember.
To remember. All the feasts come down to that one word. To remember. To remember. To remember what God did for them. One thing they said was to tell your children. Are there stories in your life that you want to make sure your children know? How do you go about telling them those? Do you wait for the occasions to come up, or do you tell them every year like clockwork? Are there stories about, I know for me, sometimes it's special times with family, like holidays. Christmas was always such a fun time in my house and in my family's house. And every year at Christmas time, I end up telling the same old Christmas stories. They might hear a new one this year compared to last year, but they've heard them all about Christmas with my family. Are there things that you want to make sure your kids know about their ancestry? About who their grandparents were, about who their great-grandparents were, about who their parents are, who you were when you were younger, before they knew you as the old guy that's losing his hair. If that doesn't apply to you, I'm sorry. Thankful. What is it that you want to share with your kids? And how important is that? Do you share with them what God's done in your life? Sometimes that's hard for us as parents because that means admitting that we have problems. One thing I've made sure never to shy away from with anybody is tell them I got problems. Y'all know that first day I got here, I made sure to tell you I had problems. One thing I've never shied away with my kids is telling them the problems in my family history. Because just because they had those problems doesn't make them, one, any less important to me, any less valuable as ancestry, or in any way diminish what they're coming from. Nor does it make them right, but they were in a different age and time. Should I share with my kids the stories about... I grew up in cotton country. All my ancestors owned slaves. Should I share that with them, or should I...
You should share it.
Well, it wasn't right. It paints them in a bad picture. Makes them look ugly. It's truth. It's where they come from. It's where it's their heritage. I do not encourage them to go buy a slave, but I will share with them the stories, and actually some of them are really good. One of the mothers was always really good about, would never want to own slaves, would never allow her husband to buy slaves, but he was real sneaky, so he would go down and loan somebody a bunch of money, or so he would say, and then when the guy couldn't pay him back, he said, well, I had to take this slave in trade, but he would actually go buy one that he knew had like 19 brothers, sisters, aunts, and cousins and stuff, so then he'd come home, and she'd say, well, you're coming in the house with me, and I'm going to take care of him. So, okay, whatever you want to do. I just had to take him or we wouldn't get our money back. And he goes in the house and cries and whines to the woman about how he's got a big family he left, and she comes out and says, you're going back down there buying all of them. So she was doing pretty good, and he was kind of sneaky. But I share with them the stories of my ancestry. I share with them what God's done in my life every chance I get, over and over and over again, because I don't ever want them to forget the power of God. We read, it just made me think, in the book of Joshua. Oh, and it opened right to the page. That's pretty neat. That's pretty neat. We read about Joshua, and I think it's right in the first verse. It says, after the... I think it's right there in the first chapter. I won't make you sit while I read and find it. But it says, after Joshua died, a generation grew up that did not know Joshua. Did not know what the Lord had done. Do we want a generation to grow up that doesn't know us? That doesn't know what the Lord's done in our lives?
Well, we as Christians don't, but the world itself doesn't care.
If you don't see a truth, there's no sense in teaching your child the truth. But if we know that there's no way there, we've seen success and we've seen failure, and we know what measures success and failure, and it's not money, and it's not about education, and it's not about the things that the world measures it as. So do we want them to grow up and know what the Lord's done in our lives? I believe we can. We don't have to talk about Passover here in the same way that I might talk about it in a youth camp or at a jail or somewhere where there are people who may not have experienced Passover. I'm going on the assumption that we've all experienced a deliverance from the Lord. They would tell that story every year about the time God showed up in a mighty way and delivered us out of our sin, out of our bad attitudes, out of our problematic lives, out of our stinking thinking that we're God and that we can control everything. And He showed up and pulled us out of that. And He didn't fix us. We're still broken, but He pulled us out of that. He pulled them out of Egypt and then immediately requires that they get the Egypt out of them. So that they still had problems. They're still crying and whining about cucumbers and leeks 2 or 3 days later, wanting to go back. It's always the funniest part of the story to me. Oh, we had good food. I know they raped our women and they beat our children, yeah, and they killed them and all. But we had good food. It's amazing what food will do. So that's another question I have for you. Have you ever noticed how God uses a meal as such a teaching tool, as such an instrumental part of our relationship with Him? How many different... name some meals that you can think of in the Bible that were just truly transformational. I'll go ahead and start you off. The apple was pretty transformational. I'm just saying. It changed things. What can y'all think of? Mm-hmm. We mentioned Joseph, and he was eating with his brothers when he revealed who he was. When after Jesus' resurrection, he went and found the fishermen and he cooked them breakfast. He met with the guys on the road to Emmaus. Did y'all hear some more about? But he meets with them on the road to Emmaus, and when were their eyes opened? It says when he broke the bread.
The loaves and the fishes.
Loaves and the fishes. You got 2 examples there. Feeding everybody. The wedding feast.
Wedding feast, yeah.
And the parable of the wedding feast. You've got the wedding feast in Cana, and you've got the parable of the wedding feast.
Mm-hmm.
You know what my favorites is? In the Old Testament, in Exodus, it says that Moses and Aaron go up on the mountain and they talk to God and they have a little powwow, and they come back down and they get the 70 elders. You remember Moses had to appoint 70 elders because he couldn't keep up with all the work. And he takes the 70 elders up on the mountain with him, and it says they eat a meal there with God. Now, what'd that look like? Because it didn't just say God hovered over them while they ate a meal. It says they ate a meal with God. None of us can even fathom what that is. I don't know. We'll never know. It doesn't give us more information to know. We can guess, but it ain't scriptural. But that to me is amazing. They ate a meal with God. We see the value of, yeah.
I was going to say, one of the first things that came to my mind about food wasn't just like a sit-down meal, but there were such great lessons learned from the manna
Mm-hmm.
and the quail.
And the quail.
I mean, that's very powerful.
Yeah. God uses food as a teaching tool, doesn't He? I don't know, maybe it's because it's so integral in our lives. Maybe it's just because it's, there's something about a meal, isn't there?
We have to have it.
As somebody said one time, they said, Let's see if I'm butchering this. I ain't heard the quote in years, and I didn't think of it ahead of time. Normally, I would Google these things and get them right before I come in here. But I believe he said it's a meal gains greater fellowship than any other time. It's hard to maintain your dignity while asking for the tomato ketchup. We're all on an equal plane then. Rich or poor, you got to eat. Whether you do it fancy with a pinky up or you just slop it up, it doesn't matter. You're communing over a meal. And see, there used to be a word that we don't use a whole lot anymore. I hope y'all are familiar with it at this church, but it's a covenant. And a covenant, another word for covenant would be testament. We have the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Old Covenant and the New Testament. But when you ate a meal with someone, you formed a covenant with them. You said, I'll die for you. Because if I'm going to take my precious resources and I'm going to share them with you, I may be killing myself because I may starve to death. I may run out of food right now. So if I'm going, there were several things that made you enter. If you read in Scripture, if someone steps over the threshold of the doorway, they just entered into a covenant. You didn't let somebody in your house unless you were entering to a covenant with them. And if you sat down and ate a meal with someone, that was a covenant bond. You entered into a covenant with them. Just thinking of it, I think of David and allowing Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul, the son of Jonathan, to come and dine at his table. They had to carry him to the table. He was lame, but he got to eat at the table to honor the covenant that David had with Jonathan, because they had a covenant formed early on in their lives. Covenant's a very powerful thing. That's what a marriage is. We think of it as a contract a lot of times. That's just pitiful and poor. It's a covenant. It's not, you do your part and I do my part, and if you don't do your part, then I'm out. I'm free. No, it's you do your part and I'm going to do my part. No matter what happens, we're not free. There is no going away. We think that marriage has to end if certain things happen, like, oh, well, she cheated on me, I get to leave now. Well, actually, it's a covenant. Now, if you want to, ain't nobody going to hold it against you. I've got a divorce, but it's a covenant. I shouldn't have. I can't say that I'm sorry I did. I wish I could. But I think things worked out pretty good the way they did. But it's a covenant. And I didn't really understand that when I went into it the first time. So, of course, I didn't understand it when I left it. I've known godly people that understood it and still had to walk away because the other one had walked away. It was a matter of file the paperwork or not. But it was already dead. But we don't understand the covenant that happens over a meal sometimes. That bonding, that fellowship. You become closer with somebody like never before. What do we always do when we want to see our friends? We cook for them, don't we? Y'all some good cooks, I know you are. Squirrel gravy and biscuits.
We were just talking about that last night.
Steve was talking about cooking up bear. Or if it's steak and potatoes, whatever it is, there's something about entering into that fellowship with someone over a meal. There's something special that happens over a meal. There'll be a great wedding feast in heaven. All of this will culminate with a great wedding feast. There's so much that goes on with a meal. God uses that meal to show us things. So I want us to think about that as we look at the different feasts. All the feasts had to do with a meal. All of them were centered around food and celebration and abundance. Let's think about that as we go through. One of the things that we look at is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the part of the Passover that said you couldn't eat leavened bread. Because you can't take leavened bread with you, right? They didn't have time to let it rise, and they couldn't take the bread with them. How would the bread do if it was halfway risen and you start riding on a camel that's every time it steps? It's not going to work out real well, is it? Might as well leave it out to begin with. What does leaven represent for us in Scripture?
Sin.
Sin. Almost every time. I try never to be exclusive on things like that because it represents sin every time except the time it doesn't. Except the time God said, no, it doesn't. You don't ever put God in a box, but that's what I was looking for. In 1 Corinthians 8:1, he tells us about it. And he gives us a little analogy. I could make the analogy now that I've learned it from him, but he says it, so why not we go on and look at it from him? Let's see if I got this right. Somebody got 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Verse 1 and 2 and 3.
Which verses?
1, 2, and 3.
Got it here. Now concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God is known by him.
So he said, knowledge puffs up,
Yeah.
but what builds up?
Love.
Love builds up. Well, isn't that what sin does? Isn't that what leaven does in bread? It doesn't put anything in it but air, does it? It puffs up the bread. But it didn't really, it made it look bigger. It made it taste a little better. It's airy and fluffy, but it didn't make it any bigger. 2 pounds of dough is still 2 pounds of dough. It didn't build anything up. If you wanted to build it up, you're going to have to add something else in there. You can throw some sugar in there. That'd build it up. Love builds up, but knowledge just puffs up. A lot of times if we get too much knowledge, we start thinking we know everything about something. Oh, then we've had it. That's what I love about teaching this to you. I thought I knew a lot about the feast. Now I'm learning all kinds of stuff about the feast I never knew before. This is great. When we think we have all this knowledge, it just puffs us up. When we have sin in our lives, it puffs us up. We're just filled with air, but we're not built up on anything, which means it doesn't take, what does it take to a loaf of bread? What does kneading look like? One little smack in your, it's like popping a balloon. And you're done.
Doesn't it also represent, besides something, spreading, sin, spreads, sin?
Yep. It multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. But love builds up. That's one way he's shown us talking about the sin in our lives. Passover is a time for us to address the sin in our lives. When we think of Passover, not just the physical time of the year, but as we think through this, it's a time to think through the sin in our lives. Think through what we have in us. You know, I was talking to us Sunday about what do we have in us that we don't even know about. We need God to reveal it to us. We have yeast in our house that we don't know about. He would reveal it to us. We need the same thing to go on in our spiritual lives. So as we look at Passover, we have a time of getting rid of sin and being delivered. The blood being applied to the doorpost. The meal, the Seder meal, I think is what I'm trying to stay away from. So I think that's what Jackie's going to share with you the most on. And the remembrance of the things in their lives. What were those things that they ate, though? We'll touch on them.
I saw them bitter herbs.
Bitter herbs is one.
Egg.
The egg. Horseradish. See if I got a picture of one here.
Doesn't sound very good to me.
There's a lamb bone.
And horseradish.
I used to know a Jewish guy. He said that he remembered doing Passover, and he wasn't real sure that he understood everything. But he took a piece of the matzah bread, and he was like, all right, I get the unleavened bread and all that, but why horseradish? And he dipped it in the horseradish, and he took a bite. And he's like a 10-year-old kid. Mm-hmm. So when he took a bite of that horseradish, he started crying. Yeah. And he said, I kind of get it now. They spent 400 years in slavery. Bet you they cried a lot of tears. Bet you they cried a lot of tears. Do we share with our kids the tears that we cry, or do we only have weak moments behind closed doors and never share with them the hurts and the pains in our lives? Sometimes I think we do a disservice to our kids hiding too much. We want to be strong for them. We want them to know that when they grow up and they got problems in their lives, they can come to us and we can handle it. So that's good and that's right. But what about when they do have problems and they just need to cry for a minute and they think, well, I can't do that because nobody in my family ever did that. Luckily, I was delivered to that. I'll cry in front of you in a minute, probably. I cry all the time. Good animal commercial or something, have me going.
But it'd also be doing our kids a disservice if we didn't let
Yeah. And that's what we go to every time at our house. My wife is very open and honest about everything. And there's nothing in her that she won't share with you. You'll learn that real quick. Almost too much sharing sometimes. But she suffers from psychological nudity. I got that some guy off the radio, I heard that said, and I said, that's her right there. Because whatever's going on in here, you can see, because she just bears all. But she makes sure, sometimes she says, oh, well, they see me having problems and falling apart at different things. How can that be good for them? Because what do you do when you fall apart? Well, what's your strength? Where does your strength come from? The joy of the Lord is our strength. So they see where our foundation is and that it actually makes a difference in our lives. All too often, we have kids growing up, and this is what I firmly believe is one of the problems with my generation and the ones under, is we've seen our parents going through with the rituals of Christianity, but never seen that power enacted in their lives. And the only reason they did it is because they seen their parents going through the rituals and they seen a power in their lives. So you've got a generation that's behaving as Christians and feeling the power in their lives. So another generation seeks to copy the actions and just the rituals. So we go to church on Sunday. We take communion when he says it. We stand up when he says stand up. We sit down when he says sit down. We read our Bible in the morning, but we sure don't pay attention. But we go through the rituals and we go through the motions of life because we've seen them do it and we feel like it ought to help. But how many of you know that it's not in a formula? That's why celebrating these feasts will not do anything for us, because there's not a formula to God. There's not a formula to get His attention. Knowing and understanding the heart of God is powerful, and we can do that through the feast. But a dead tradition's a dead tradition, whether it's Christian or Judaism. Doesn't matter. So as we look through these, how do we see our deliverance? Have we shared that with our kids? Have you shared with your kids what you did in college? Mine was before college, during college, and after college. And you know I've shared it with them because they're sitting there when I was talking about a careers, and they've heard it several times before. Do we share with them our mistakes? Do we share with them? That can be touchy, can't it? How do you tell your kids about your underage drinking without giving them license to drink when they're young? We make sure to never glorify anything that we did. We tell them the honest truth about how horrible it was, or we don't say it at all. Sometimes we take for granted when we talk to it amongst each other that we remember how horrible it was. But if we leave out the bad, then they're liable to do it. But if we leave out the good, they're liable to do it too. I don't know if I mentioned it when I gave my testimony, but I probably did at the Gideon thing, which I'll be back to. I talked to him the other day. But one of the reasons why I tried drugs in the first place is because I heard all the statistics about what it would do against you and how horrible it was. I used to dress up like a clown and go to the elementary schools and do skits about just say no to drugs. I knew the bad stuff, but then what I could not rectify is they told me 1 in 5 kids in your high school are using drugs. And I looked around and I counted up and I'm like, okay. Well, it's 6 people in this room. And everybody in this room looks like a smart person. It looks like they make good decisions. So there's got to be something attractive about it. No one ever told me what was attractive about it. And because of that, I went out curious to find out what was attractive about it. Had someone explained to me what was attractive and what wasn't, and had been honest in it, instead they lied and said, well, drugs will kill you the first time you use them, and that's the truth for some drugs, but they'll show a picture of somebody smoking pot. Well, I look in the community and I see that's a lie. If they'd have told me the truth, you smoke pot, you get the munchies, you gain 40 pounds. I might have done things a little differently and I might not be on a diet right now. I had never lost this 40 pounds. So I make sure to share things like that with my kids too about diet. My son's like, oh, I wish I could buy a candy bar every time I go to the store. I said, you know what, I could. I used to work out in the cotton fields and they'd give me a couple bucks every day and I'd save up my money. And during the right time of the year, I'd just ride my bike down to the store and get a soda pop and a candy bar. And he's like, oh, that sounds great. I'm like, where do you think that came from? I still got some of those candy bars. That's not as fun as it looks. You think it's fun, but we share with them the consequences and what happened, what fell apart in our lives because of that. Have you shared with your children your deliverance? Have you shared with yourself your deliverance? Are you aware of just how bad you were? Because a lot of you wasn't near as bad as I was. Sometimes you got to look a little harder. Well, we all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and we're all nasty. How do we share with our kids these things? Anybody that shared anything with their kids about their youth?
Sometimes through stories, sometimes just sitting down and talking to them.
Do you do it once? Or have you done it over and over again? I have to tell my kid about that candy bar a lot. That's attractive to him. He sees the good part. I got to keep reminding him of the bad. That was the thing about Passover, is it was yearly. So every year they had to be reminded, and every year they had to be reminded. So where did they go wrong? How did they fall apart as a Jewish nation? We see them so strong, and they go into the promised land, and they're just slaying giants by the power of God. And we see them as they start, we see some things falling apart, but there's still some mighty people in Israel, and things are going good. And then all of a sudden, we look down the road a little bit, and we've got people, nobody knows God, and everybody's just afar off from Him. And they get taken away into captivity to Babylon. And what happened? You know, in Babylon it was against the law to celebrate the feast. But before that they wasn't doing it either. They wasn't talking about the power of God in their midst. They wasn't sharing with each other the power of God in their midst. No one told the story anymore. If you read in, Ezra mentions it, and in Nehemiah, who's talking about Ezra as well, Ezra gets up and reads from the book of the law when they dedicate the temple. Nehemiah is about rebuilding, and they rebuild the temple. And he says they all gather together and they read the book, and the people cry. The whole congregation of the entire nation of Israel that has returned, it's a much smaller number because some of them are still in captivity, but those that are there are just in tears, and they stand there all day. I don't know what they mean by all day. I don't know if they mean 8 hours, 12 hours, or 16 hours. They stood there all day. He's just reading and reading. They're like, no, don't quit. Give me more. Give me more. I need to hear that. I've never heard that. And you know one thing that really upset them? Is they said, we heard about the feast we're supposed to be having. We ain't been doing that. They said, really? Because according to my calendar, like 2 or 3 days from now is the Feast of Tabernacles. Why don't we do that? They said it was the most joyous occasion you read about in the Old Testament is when in Nehemiah they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles. They were so excited because they had experienced repentance and they were back on the right track. And they were going to tell their kids the story. And they were going to tell their kids about what was going on. Read on. 100 years. They stopped telling the stories. They stopped celebrating the feast. You know, you didn't have to go to all the feast. Feast of First Fruits, nobody celebrates that nowadays. Except Christians. Because guess what happened on the Feast of First Fruits? Up from the grave he arose. With mighty... Never mind. Get me singing. We celebrate it, but they don't really celebrate it. Not every feast was mandatory attendance. Passover, you don't go to Jerusalem, you celebrate it in your house. You can go to Jerusalem, you should go to Jerusalem. But if you miss it, you got another date you can come. Feast of Unleavened Bread, you're going to do that wherever you do the Passover. Feast of First Fruits is almost non-existent. You ask a Jew now and they have no clue about it. Oh, but they know about some of the other ones. Purim. Oh, they all celebrate Purim. You know what you had to do at Purim? Every man, woman, and child, they finally instituted a rule that said you didn't have to do it if you were under 12. Has to get so drunk that they can barely walk. Oh, they love Purim. Oh, yeah. That was from Esther. It's not a feast recorded by God telling you to do this. This is the Jews celebrating after Haman's hung in his own front yard, and the Mordecai is now exonerated, and all the Jews are let off the hook. So they all feasted and had a big party. So the Jews took that as, okay, well, we'll just get so drunk we can barely walk. They love that feast. But where's the Feast of First Fruits? Where's the Feast of Trumpets? It's not that important. That's why we see the Jewish religion getting smaller and smaller every year, and smaller every year. And if we stop telling the stories of Christianity, we start getting smaller. As we see in America, Christianity is declining. We're shrinking every day. We're shrinking in numbers. Well, what stories are we not telling anymore? Well, we're still telling stories. Santa Claus. Oh, wait, that's not in there, is it? Oh, yeah. Not telling a whole lot about Christmas, are we? We're telling a story. We're just not telling his story. We do Easter. If you go to church, we're really good at telling you what Easter is. But what does it look like to the world? We got a bunch of eggs and some candy. Had a guy get out of jail a couple of years ago, and I was inviting him to church. And of course, every pastor that comes there invites him to church. So he's going to somebody else. He said, "Well, but I got to go to this place because it's Easter, and my kids want to go to the Easter egg hunt." All right. So a couple weeks later, he comes to church with me, and we're riding along, and I'm talking to him about it. He was like, "Yeah, I went to that place on Easter. You know what I found out? Easter? That's the day Jesus died." I didn't have a heart to correct him. This man was 56 years old. I wanted to tell him, no, that's not the day he died. But he's 56 years old. He'd lived in Overton County all 56 years. And he just learned that Easter has something to do with Jesus' resurrection. Now, we think everybody knows that. So we celebrate with eggs and we say it's to celebrate new life. My kid's gone to Easter egg hunts. I don't like it. But unless I can do something more fun for them, I'm not taking that out. I just add something to it. We add in a bunch of other Easter stuff to make sure they never forget what it's about. Because it's not about being legalistic and saying, no, you can't have a Christmas tree because there's no Christmas tree in the Christmas story. We can celebrate Christmas at our house and my kids know very clearly what it's about. And we have a Christmas tree. But we never tell them that there's a Santa. I was so tempted to. My wife held a hard line on that, though, and I wanted to. I went outside a couple times with some bells and rang them next to their window. They swore up and down they saw Santa Claus. But when they would ask, is Santa real? We'd say, what do you think? What do you think? And they'll go on in their own mind and figure something out, and they have fun with it. But I never had to tell them anything other than Jesus for Christmas. Had I started from the beginning, I probably would. When I came along, my kids were 6 and 3. I'm their stepfather. So because they were a little older and my wife had been doing it for a while, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have been able to do it. But what stories are we telling our kids? And how does that affect us growing as Christianity, as Christians? Do they grow as Christians if we don't tell them any stories? If they just grow up and we say, come to church, preacher will tell you a story. Well, that don't work, does it? I don't say it. If that worked, how come all the preachers' kids are so awful? I was very thankful when my son told the first congregation I was at, he said, I'm not your typical preacher's kid. I was like, well, thank goodness. You keep remembering that when you get to be 18. I don't want you acting like a typical preacher's kid. How can we share those stories with them better? How can we help them to remember what sin looked like in our lives? How can we be their priest?
But you know, Brother Tim, not only our children, but the young Christians in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Timothy said, or Titus 2 says that the older to teach the younger. How do we teach them? Those in the community. Those that see us and know we're Christians. What are we teaching them when we sit and complain about the service at a restaurant and bad talk the waiter when they're not there? What does the table next to us here? You know how many times I've done that? I luckily hadn't done that in years, but I used to be real bad at that because I was trained in service and I know every little aspect. And I'd sit there and say, oh, yeah, she doesn't know what she's doing. And you see what she did. Right. She set that plate down with the potato facing me. She's supposed to turn it over where the meat face. You can't believe that. Oh, that's pitiful. That's pitiful. So do we share those things? Should we? How can we do that more? How can we have conversations with our kids instead of just telling them not to do things? Tell them, you know what, I did what you're doing right now. I did that. Want to hear about it? It didn't work out good. It didn't work out real good for me. Yeah, that boy you're dating, you ought to ask your mom about that. She dated a boy just like that. Ask her how that worked out. So Jackie will come next week and she'll share with us a lot of the symbolism in it. And she'll probably give us a lot of information to digest in one night. But let's keep looking back to not what does Passover look like? What does it look like to celebrate Passover as a Jew? But what does it look like to live in Passover as a Christian? What does it look like to experience that as a Christian? And how do we apply that to the annual telling to our kids? Any questions? Y'all got to have questions.
No, I think when you talk about telling the story, I think that the reason that sometimes we don't is that we don't spend enough time building that type of relationship with our children. It seems like that in this day and time, we're all so busy that our children are playing sports, or they're going here, they're going that, and they got this project, that project, that we don't make the time to sit down and